April 5th, 1933. Franklin Roosevelt has been President of the United States for 32 days. He signs a document numbered Executive Order 6102. Its title is Forbidding the Hoarding of Gold Coin, Gold Bullion, and Gold Certificates. What it says is that every person in the United States must deliver their gold to a Federal Reserve Bank or a member bank, all of it, with a short list of exceptions. The deadline is the 1st of May. That is 26 days. You will be paid in paper currency at the legal price of $20.67 per ounce. And if you keep it, if you decide that the gold coins in your dresser drawer are your property and none of the government's business, the order specifies a fine of up to $10,000 or up to 10 years in prison, or both. Hold that number for a second, because it does not mean anything until you scale it. Median family income in the United States in 1933 was somewhere in the region of $1,500 a year. The maximum fine was therefore around 6 years of a typical family's entire income, before you get to the decade in a federal prison. And here is what is genuinely remarkable about the spring of 1933, and what nobody expects when they first hear this story. People complied, overwhelmingly, voluntarily, and fast. They queued at bank counters in overcoats and felt hats. They brought double eagles saved for a daughter's wedding, coins put by from a good year, gold certificates out of a safe. Newsreels showed it. It was framed as a patriotic act, and after 3 years in which 9,000 American banks had failed, an enormous number of people genuinely believed that hoarding was what had broken the country. Hundreds of millions of dollars in gold came in over those few weeks. Now here's the second date, the 31st of January 1934, 275 days after the deadline. The president signs a proclamation setting a new official price for gold, $35 an ounce. The gold that had been bought from the American public at $20.67 was now, by proclamation, worth $35. That is an increase of about 69%. And on the metal sitting in its vaults, the metal it had just finished collecting, the United States Treasury booked a paper profit of roughly $2.8 billion. $2 billion of that was immediately used to capitalize a new fund controlled by the Secretary of the Treasury alone, which required no appropriation from Congress and which still exists today. So, the government made it a crime to hold the asset. It bought the asset at the old price. Then it set the new price. You can see why this story has the reputation it has. It is told constantly as the great American gold robbery, the moment a government stole from its own citizens in broad daylight. And I am going to tell you now that the popular version of this story is substantially wrong. Not the dates, which are real, the mechanism, the enforcement, and above all the conclusion. The most repeated detail in every retelling, the federal agents drilling open safe deposit boxes to seize the gold inside, did not happen. The one prosecution anybody can name ended with the government losing. And the hardest fact of all, the one that almost nobody who tells this story is willing to say, is that the policy worked. Here's what actually happened. The thesis of this video is a sequence, not a crime. A government cannot change the price of its own money while its citizens remain free to convert that money into the underlying asset at the old price. It is not that this is unwise. It is that it is arithmetically impossible the moment the market expects the change, everyone converts, and you have no gold left to devalue against. So if you have decided to devalue, the exit has to close first. The call-in was not the objective. The call-in was the precondition. Everything that offends people about 1933, the coercion, the deadline, the profit, the fact that the people who obeyed lost out, follows from that order of operations. And that order of operations is not a historical curiosity. It is the standard shape of every currency crisis that has happened since. To see why any of this was necessary, you have to understand what was actually happening to America in the winter of 1933, and it is worse than most people realize. Between 1930 and the start of 1933, roughly 9,000 American banks failed, not were rescued, failed, and took their depositors' money with them. This produced a chain reaction with 2 links, and both of them ran on fear. The first link, people stopped trusting banks and pulled their deposits out as cash. Every dollar withdrawn shrank the deposit base that the banking system lends against, which forced banks to call in loans, which killed businesses, which caused more failures, which caused more withdrawals. The second link is the one that matters here. A growing number of people stopped trusting paper currency as well, and converted it into gold, which they were entitled to do. A dollar bill was on its face a claim on a fixed quantity of metal. And the same thing was happening internationally. Foreign holders of dollars, watching an American banking system disintegrate, were converting and shipping the gold home. By February 1933, this had become a run on the currency itself. Michigan declared a bank holiday and closed its banks. The panic spread state by state as depositors elsewhere drew the obvious conclusion. By March 4th, Inauguration Day. The banks of almost every state in the Union were shut, including New York and Illinois. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York had watched an enormous share of its gold reserve walk out of the door in the final days of February. The financial system of the largest economy on Earth had simply stopped. Roosevelt was inaugurated on a Saturday. He told the country the only thing it had to fear was fear itself. 2 days later, on Monday the 6th of March, he declared a national bank holiday and suspended gold payments and gold exports. And here is the legal detail that people who dislike this story are right to point at. The authority he used was the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, a First World War statute written to let the government control transactions with enemy aliens. It was being used in peacetime against American citizens on the theory that an old wartime power had never been fully repealed. Congress cured the problem 3 days later with the Emergency Banking Act of March 9, 1933, which retroactively approved everything the president had done and gave him the power to require the surrender of gold. That act passed the House in a matter of hours. There had not been time to print enough copies. The bill was read aloud from the only available draft, and members voted on legislation restructuring the entire monetary system of the United States without having read it. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is the congressional record. And it is what emergency legislating looks like everywhere, in every country, in every era. So now the government has the power. The question is why it wanted it, and that requires understanding what the gold standard was actually doing to America. Under a gold standard, the quantity of money in an economy is bolted to the quantity of gold in its vaults. That is the entire point of the system. It is a rule that stops governments from printing. In normal times, that discipline is a feature. In a deflation, it is a death sentence. And America, in 1933, was in the worst deflation in its history. Prices had fallen by roughly a quarter to a third since 1929. Now, falling prices sound pleasant if you have money. Here's what they actually do. Imagine a farmer with a mortgage of $2,000 taken out in 1928 to be repaid out of the wheat he grows. By 1932, the price of his wheat has collapsed. The mortgage has not. He now has to grow and sell dramatically more wheat to pay the same $2,000. Nobody changed his contract. Nobody raised his interest rate. The debt simply got heavier in real terms month after month because money was becoming more valuable relative to everything he could produce. Multiply that across every farm, every mortgage, every business loan, and every bond in the country. Deflation is a mechanism that transfers wealth from debtors to creditors, continuously and automatically, without anybody voting for it. And when the debtors default en masse, it destroys the creditors too. Now, the obvious question, America had a central bank. The Federal Reserve had been created in 1913 precisely to stop banking panics. Why did it not simply print? This is the single most argued about question in American economic history, and there are two answers, and they are both partly right. The first is Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz's, and it is an accusation. They argued that the Federal Reserve had the power to act and chose not to, that it stood by while the money supply contracted by about a third, and that the Depression was therefore not a failure of capitalism, but a failure of one institution to do its job. The second answer is the one associated with Barry Eichengreen, and he called it golden fetters. On this reading, the Fed's hands were substantially tied by the gold standard itself. Each Federal Reserve note had to be backed by a legally specified proportion of gold. Expand aggressively, and you approach the legal limit, and everybody watching can see it, which triggers exactly the conversion run you are trying to prevent. That is what was happening in February 1933. The Fed was not merely being timid. It was being watched, and it knew that any sign of expansion would accelerate the drain. So the gold standard, which existed to make money trustworthy, had become the reason the money could not be trusted. The rule that was supposed to prevent a panic was manufacturing one. There is one way to stop it, and only one. You have to raise prices, which means putting more money into the system, which the gold standard forbids you to do, unless you change the price of gold. This was not an eccentric idea. Britain had already done it. It left the gold standard in September 1931, its currency fell, and its recovery began. Roosevelt's advisors, and in particular, an agricultural economist named George Warren, argued the point directly. Raise the dollar price of gold, and you raise the dollar price of everything else. That is the mechanism. That is the objective. But you cannot do it while the public can still cash out at the old price. And so on April 5th, 1933, the exit closed. Let us look at what Executive Order 6102 actually said, because the popular version is a caricature in both directions. It required delivery of all gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates, not gold jewelry, not gold teeth, not, despite what you will read, wedding rings. The exemptions were real and reasonably generous. You could keep up to $100 in gold coin and certificates, around 5 ounces at the old price, and a meaningful sum for an ordinary household. You could keep rare and unusual coins of recognized value to collectors, an exemption that saved a great many collections outright. Gold needed in industry, art, or a profession was exempt, which covered dentists, jewelers, watchmakers, and manufacturers. You could hold a reasonable amount for foreign travel. And you were paid, in full, at $20.67 an ounce, which was the legal price of gold and had been the legal price of gold since 1834. Nobody was expropriated without compensation. It is also worth being honest about who actually held gold coin in 1933, because the popular image, the pensioner handing over her life savings, is not quite the picture. Most Americans in 1933 did not have gold coin. They had paper, and increasingly they had nothing. The bulk of the monetary gold in the country sat in banks, in businesses, in the accounts of the wealthy, and in the hands of foreign holders. But there's a sharper version of the grievance, and it is true. In the panic of February 1933, ordinary people had gone to their banks and converted paper into coin, precisely because they had been told all their lives that gold was the safe thing, the real thing, the thing that could not fail. So the people most exposed on the 1st of May were, disproportionately, the people who had most recently done the prudent thing. They had run to the exit 6 weeks before it was welded shut. That distinction matters, and I want to be precise about it because it is where most of the internet gets this wrong. What happened in April 1933 was not confiscation in the ordinary sense of the word. It was compulsory purchase at the statutory price. What the public lost was not the value of their gold. It was the gain from a revaluation that had not happened yet, and which the government was already planning. That is a real grievance. It is also a completely different grievance from theft, and if you cannot hold that distinction, the rest of this story will not make sense. Then, 2 months later, came the part almost nobody talks about, and it was far bigger. On the 5th of June 1933, Congress passed a joint resolution abolishing gold clauses. A gold clause was a standard contractual provision, written into an enormous share of American long-term debt, corporate bonds, railway bonds, mortgages, and the bonds of the United States government itself. It said, in effect, this debt is repayable in gold coin of the present weight and fineness. It was insurance against exactly what the government was about to do. The resolution voided them, all of them, retroactively, in public and private contracts alike. Understand what would have happened without it. To value the dollar by 40% while every major contract in the country carries a gold clause, and every one of those debts automatically increases by the amount of the devaluation. The entire structure of American debt would have detonated, and the largest debtor blown up would have been the federal government. So the same policy that took gold from citizens also canceled, by statute, the contractual protection that citizens and companies had bought against currency devaluation. If you want the sharpest single sentence in this story, that is it. The call-in got the medal. The joint resolution got the promises. A month later, the world found out what all this was for. Through the summer of 1933, 66 nations were meeting in London at a World Monetary and Economic Conference, trying to agree on stabilizing exchange rates and getting international trade moving again. The American delegation was there. Everyone assumed Washington wanted a deal. On the 3rd of July, Roosevelt sent the conference a message from a yacht off the New England coast, and it detonated the whole thing. He declared that the old fetishes of so-called international bankers were being replaced by efforts to plan national currencies, and that the sound internal economic system of a nation was a greater factor in its well-being than the price of its currency in changing terms of the currencies of other nations. Translated, America intends to raise its own prices, and it does not much care what that does to the exchange rate or to anyone else. The conference collapsed within weeks. The message is still known as the bombshell, and John Maynard Keynes, who was in London, wrote that Roosevelt was magnificently right, that a country in a deflation must reflate first and negotiate afterwards. So by early July 1933, the intention was on the record, publicly, in a message that made front pages on 2 continents. Anyone still holding dollars expecting the old gold price to survive had been told. Then came the strangest 3 months in the history of American monetary policy, and almost nobody knows about them. Beginning on the 25th of October 1933, the government started buying gold at deliberately rising prices through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to push the dollar down. The theory was George Warren's drive up the price of gold and the price of everything else follows. And here's how the price was set. Most mornings, Roosevelt took breakfast in bed. Around that bed would gather Henry Morgenthau, Jesse Jones of the RFC, and Warren, and while the president ate his soft-boiled eggs, the 4 of them decided the day's price of gold. On Friday, November 3rd, Morgenthau proposed a rise of 10 or 15 cents. Roosevelt chose 21. Morgenthau asked why 21? Because Roosevelt told him 3 times 7 is a lucky number. Morgenthau, who was about to become Secretary of the Treasury and would hold the job for 11 years, later wrote in his diary that if anybody knew how they really set the gold price through a combination of lucky numbers and so forth, he thought, they would be frightened. I'm not telling you that to make Roosevelt look ridiculous, although it does. I am telling you because of what it reveals about the thing you are holding. For 99 years, the dollar had been defined against gold by a fixed statutory weight, and that fixity was the entire promise. In the autumn of 1933, the price of gold in America was whatever 4 men decided over breakfast, day by day, and one of the inputs was numerology. The gold in the vault had not changed. The rule had become a conversation. And then, with the exit sealed and the contracts neutralized, the price moved. The Gold Reserve Act was signed on January 30th, 1934. It transferred legal title to all monetary gold from the Federal Reserve banks to the United States Treasury. The Fed handed over the metal and received gold certificates in exchange, which is still the arrangement today. And it gave the president the power to fix the gold content of the dollar at between 50 and 60% of its old weight. The next day, he set it at just over 59%, which, expressed the other way around, is $35 an ounce. The dollar had been devalued by about 41%. The price of gold had risen by about 69%. Same event, 2 arithmetics, and which one you quote tends to reveal what you want the listener to feel. Now the accounting, which is the part that makes people genuinely angry, and I think justifiably. The Treasury was holding a very large quantity of gold that it had booked at $20, 67. Overnight, that same metal was worth 35. The difference, a paper profit of roughly $2.8 billion, belonged to the government. $2 billion of it went into a new creation called the Exchange Stabilization Fund. And the Exchange Stabilization Fund is a genuinely extraordinary institution, a large pool of money under the direct control of the Secretary of the Treasury, usable to intervene in currency and credit markets, which does not require an appropriation from Congress to spend. It was created out of a revaluation gain on gold bought from the public. It has never been abolished. It was used in the 2008 financial crisis to guarantee money market funds, and again in 2020. So when people say that the American public paid for a permanent, unappropriated slush fund at the Treasury with the difference between 2 prices, they are on the facts describing what happened. And let me put the household version of that arithmetic on the table, because abstractions let people off. Take a family that walked into a bank in April 1933 and handed over 100 ounces of gold coin. That is a substantial but entirely plausible holding for a prosperous farmer or a small businessman, savings accumulated over a working life. They were paid $2,067 correctly at the legal price in full. 275 days later, that same 100 ounces was worth $3,500. The difference is $1,433. Against a median family income of around $1,500 a year, that gap is close to a full year's income for an average American household, and it accrued to the Treasury on metal. It had required them to sell at a price it was already planning to change. Nobody was robbed. Everybody was correctly paid, and the counterparty knew something the seller did not, because the counterparty was going to decide it. That is not larceny. It is something the law has no name for, because the law was on the other side of the table. The courts got their turn in February 1935, and the decision is one of the strangest in American constitutional history. 3 cases arrived together, known collectively as the Gold Clause cases. 2 concerned private and corporate obligations. The third, Perry against the United States, concerned a government bond, a Liberty Bond from the First World War, sold to the public with an explicit promise of payment in gold. The Supreme Court split 5-4. On private contracts, the majority was straightforward. Congress has constitutional authority over the currency. Gold clauses obstructed the exercise of that authority, and so they could be voided. On its own bonds, the court did something remarkable. Chief Justice Hughes held that Congress could not repudiate the obligations of the United States. The government had made a promise and had no power to break it. And then he held that Perry had suffered no recoverable damages, because even if he had been paid in gold, he would have been legally required to hand it straight back to the Treasury at the official price. So he had lost nothing the law would recognize. The government lost the principle and won the case. Perry got nothing. Justice James McReynolds, dissenting, abandoned his written text and spoke from the bench. He said this was Nero at his worst. He is reported to have added that the Constitution, as they had known it, was gone. And there is a detail that shows how close run the administration thought it was. Roosevelt had a radio address and a proclamation drafted in advance to be used if the ruling went against him, restricting the court's ability to enforce gold judgments. He never had to deliver it. Now let us deal with the myth, because it is the single most repeated claim about this entire episode, and it is not true. You will read everywhere that federal agents went into banks and drilled open Americans' safe deposit boxes to seize the gold inside. There was no such program, and there was no legal authority for one. Here's what did happen and how the confusion started. During the bank holiday of March 1933, banks were closed and safe deposit boxes were not accessible. When banks reopened for a period, a customer opening a box could be required to do so in the presence of a bank officer so that any gold found could be reported. That is intrusive, and people at the time hated it. It is not agents with drills. As for enforcement, there was almost none. The government was not interested in prosecuting householders. It wanted the monetary gold out of circulation, and it had got it. There is essentially one case anyone can name, and it is worth telling because it is the whole episode in miniature. Frederick Barber Campbell was a New York lawyer who had deposited about 5,000 ounces of gold bullion with the Chase National Bank, a serious quantity, worth over $200,000 at the old price. When he asked for it back, the bank refused, because handing it over would have made the bank a party to a violation. So Campbell sued the bank. And in response, in September 1933, a federal grand jury indicted him for failing to surrender it. And Campbell essentially won. The court found the order defective. The underlying statute required action by the Secretary of the Treasury, and the order Campbell was charged under had been issued over the president's signature. The prosecution collapsed on the technicality. The government quietly cured the defect by reissuing the rules properly. Campbell did not go to prison. He also never got his gold back. That is the case. That is the enforcement history of the Great American Gold Confiscation, one indictment that failed, and a legal theory so shaky that the government fixed the paperwork rather than test it again. Which brings us to the part of this story that is genuinely hard, and that most people who tell it simply refuse to say. It worked. The evidence on this is not close, and it does not come from admirers of the New Deal. It is one of the most robust findings in the economic history of the Great Depression, and it holds across countries. The single best predictor of when a country's recovery from the Depression began is when it left the gold standard. Britain left in 1931 and turned the corner early. The countries that clung on, France above all, and the group around it that called itself the Gold Bloc, stayed in depression until they finally gave up several years later. The correlation is close to mechanical, and the economists who established it, including Barry Eichengreen, Christina Romer, and Ben Bernanke, come at it from different directions and reach the same place. In America, the deflation stopped almost exactly when the gold link was cut. Prices, which had been falling relentlessly for 3 years, turned and rose. Industrial production surged from the spring of 1930. Between 1933 and 1937, the American economy grew at rates that are, in percentage terms, among the fastest ever recorded in its history from a catastrophic base, but the direction had reversed. The farmer with the $2,000 mortgage was rescued by exactly the mechanism that took his gold coins. And here is the effect nobody planned at all. At $35 an ounce, the United States was now the best paying buyer of gold on earth, and it was open for business. Between 1934 and 1940, as Europe slid towards catastrophe, gold poured into America. Capital flight, from a continent arming for war, refugees moving what they could, central banks shifting reserves somewhere they could not be seized by an approaching army. The American gold stock did not just recover, it roughly tripled. There was so much of it that the Treasury had to build somewhere new to put it. Construction of the United States Bullion Depository at Fort Knox, Kentucky was completed in 1936, and the first shipments arrived in January 1937. Now connect that to what happened next, because this is where this story stops being American history and becomes everybody's. 10 years later, in a hotel in New Hampshire, delegates from 44 countries wrote the rules of the post-war monetary world. And when an Indian delegate asked which currencies counted as convertible into gold, an American Treasury economist explained that it would be simpler to just read United States dollar wherever the text said gold. He could say that because it was true, and it was true because of the vault in Kentucky. The metal that filled that vault came from two sources: the gold called in from American citizens in 1933 at $20.67, and the gold that fled Europe afterwards because America had set the highest price in the world. If you have seen the Bretton Woods video, that is where the gold came from. There is one more date, and it is the one that reframes everything. Private gold ownership remained illegal for Americans until December 31st, 1974. Not until the end of the Depression, not until the war ended, Congress restored the right in a law signed in August 1974, and President Ford repealed Roosevelt's order effective the last day of that year. 41 years. And look at where that date falls. Richard Nixon had closed the gold window on August 15, 1971, ending the convertibility of dollars into gold for foreign governments and killing the system that 1933 had built the foundations for. Americans got the right to own gold back 3 years after the monetary system it had been taken from them to protect had already ceased to exist. An emergency measure of March 1933, justified by a banking panic, outlived the entire monetary order it was created to defend and was finally lifted by Gerald Ford. And there is one object left over from all of this, and it is the most valuable coin on earth. In 1933, before the order came, the Philadelphia Mint struck 445,500 double eagles, $20 gold pieces, the St. Gaudens design, generally considered the most beautiful coin the United States ever made. They were never issued, the order arrived, gold coinage ended, and the entire mintage was sent to be melted back into bars. On paper, every single one of them ceased to exist. A small number walked out of the mint anyway. Nobody has ever fully established how. Because those coins had never been lawfully released, the government's position was that they remained its property and that owning one was simply theft. The Secret Service spent decades tracking them down and taking them back. One escaped. It ended up in the collection of King Farouk of Egypt, who in 1944 obtained an export license from the United States Treasury, issued, by every account, in error by an official who did not check. When Farouk was overthrown, the coin vanished for 40 years and resurfaced in a sting operation in a hotel in Manhattan. The resulting settlement was that this one coin, and only this one, would be legally monetized, formally issued, so that it could be lawfully owned. In 2002, it sold at auction for $7.5 million. In June 2021, it sold again for $18,872,000. It is the most expensive coin ever sold. Think about the arithmetic. A $20 coin made of about an ounce of gold, currently worth something under 1 million times its face value, and it is worth that precisely because of the order that was supposed to destroy it. Scarcity was manufactured by a proclamation. The metal in it is worth a few $1,000s. Everything else in that price is law. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is a topic with a very particular commercial afterlife. A large amount of what is written about 1933 today is produced by people who sell gold, and the framing is always the same. The government stole your money once, and it is coming for it again. So let me be exact about what the evidence supports and what it does not. The holders were paid in full at the legal price, in currency that remained legal tender. That is compulsory purchase, not seizure. What they lost was a revaluation gain on an asset they no longer held. And the fact that the government knew the revaluation was coming is the legitimate scandal here, not a theft that did not occur. There was no mass search of safe deposit boxes. There was no wave of prosecutions. The single famous case was lost by the government. And this was not a uniquely American act. Nearly every industrial country abandoned gold in the same decade, most of them with some form of restriction on private holdings, and Britain had gone first 2 years earlier with rather less legal ceremony. And then the hard one, which I would rather not have to say and will, the policy that looks most like theft is also the policy that economists across the political spectrum most consistently credit with ending the worst deflation in American history. You were allowed to hold both of those. The legal basis was thin. The emergency powers were stretched, the profit was taken from citizens who had obeyed, and the contractual protections people had bought were canceled by statute, and it stopped a death spiral that was destroying the country. History does not owe us clean cases, and a documentary that only gives you the half you already agreed with is not informing you. So what is this really about? It is about what money actually is, and almost nobody wants to hear the answer. You think of money as a thing you own. It is not. It is a set of rules, and the rules belong to whoever has the power to change them. An American in 1932 holding gold coins believed they had stepped outside the system, that they held something real, something no proclamation could touch. They had not. They held a position inside a system, defined by a statutory price, and that price was changed on a Monday by a man with a pen. That is not an argument against owning gold. It is an argument against the belief that any asset takes you outside the reach of the authority that defines what things are worth. And there's a second lesson, which is more useful and considerably more portable. Watch the order of operations. Close the exit, then move the price. That is the sequence in 1933, and it is the sequence every single time. Capital controls before a devaluation, a bank holiday before a haircut on deposits, exchange restrictions before a peg breaks, withdrawal limits before a currency is redenominated. In every one of those cases, the restriction is announced as a temporary emergency measure to stop panic and hoarding, and in every one of those cases, it is announced first, and the price moves afterwards. When the exit closes, the price is about to move. That is the most practically valuable thing in this entire story, and it was legible in April 1933 to anyone who understood why the order had to come first. The gold that came over those bank counters in the spring of 1933 went into a vault in Kentucky. From there, it underwrote the dollar's promotion to the money of the world in 1944, and it sat there while that promise was made to 43 other countries and then broken by another president with another proclamation on another weekend in 1971. Through the whole of it, the call-in, the revaluation, the vault, the treaty, the broken promise, the gold itself never did anything at all. It sat in bars in the dark, unchanged, inert, exactly as much metal as it had ever been. Only the rules moved. If you made it this far, drop a gold coin in the comments, so I know you stayed until the end. And tell me this, if you had been standing in that queue in April 1933, holding coins you had saved for years, would you have handed them over, or would you have been the one who buried them in the yard? I read every one of them. If this kind of deep dive is what you come here for, subscribe. It genuinely helps these keep coming. I'll see you in the next one.